Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Nordic Africa Institute, this webinar relates to a new research project which Diana Hoyland-Madsen is PI, funded by the Swedish Research Council, Making Politics Safer, Gendered Violence and Electoral Temporalities. It's the first in a series about violence against women in politics that will be hosted by the Institute. So I hope that we will be seeing you again. I see from the participants list today that some of you who are joining us are already very familiar with the Institute and our work. But for those of you who are not, we're a public agency funded by Nordic governments, focused on research and science policy communication. Our research is on the social science of contemporary Africa. And with this focus, we act as a knowledge hub for Nordic and African scholars and also Nordic decision makers. We have a broad and inclusive remit, generating research on societal dynamics across the African continent. And within this, two areas where we seek to have impact are directly relevant to the topic of this seminar today. The first is on equality, social justice and inclusion. And the second is on governance, citizenship and participation. Against this background, the webinar is intended to stimulate debate on the nature of violence against women in politics and look towards experiences of how issues of violence are addressed, both in countries on the African continent and outside, in order to consider how to effectively combat such violence. As I was preparing today, I was reflecting on the fact that I come from the UK, where we've had one female politician killed within the last decade for her role in politics, and where there's vast abuse against female politicians in general, and those from Black and minority ethnic groups in particular. So I also think that I hope that there is wider learning coming from the rich knowledge and understanding across the African continent to inform international debate and action. And in this respect, we hope that the Nordic Africa Institute, in its role as a knowledge hub, can capture and amplify some of this insight on your behalf. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Diana, to take things forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would also like to welcome everyone for this webinar. As Eleanor stated, my name is Diana Hoyland-Madsen, and I'm a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute and the moderator for today. So as Eleanor also stated, this webinar is a part of a new research project, Making Politics Safer, Gendered Violence and Electoral Temporalities, with a particular focus on the countries Ghana, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. The project aims to provide more conceptual clarity on the phenomena of violence against women in politics, based on empirical case studies, and explore how the African realities speak back to the general debates on violence against women in politics. The project adopts participatory and empowering approaches with its focus on cooperation with local actors and collective coping strategies. It is action-oriented with a mapping of African institutions and networks working to combat violence against women in politics in the 3 countries, and providing inputs for actors doing candidate training. The webinar has a focus on the conditions for women once they have entered politics at local or national level in the forms of violence against women in politics, aiming at keeping women in their places, meaning outside politics. We will debate how we can understand the concept of violence against women in politics, including the continuum of different forms of violence and the specific local manifestations of violence against women in politics in African context. The webinar also touches upon the strategies or measures to address violence against women in politics. To help us explore these questions further, we have Professor Mona-Lena Krook from Rutgers University as our keynote speaker. And I read here, Mona-Lena Krook is Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University. She has published widely on gender and political representation, particularly on electoral gender quotas and the impact of women in public office. Her most recent book, Violence Against Women in Politics, from Oxford University Press 2020, won a reward, the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Since 2022, she has been lead author of the quite well-known or very well-known journal Politics and Gender. And currently she is visiting Uppsala University at the Department of Government. As discussants, we have the project partners, Professor Amanda House from Stellenbosch University. And Professor Amanda House is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, where she holds a National Research Foundation Chair in Gender Politics. Her research focuses on women and citizenship, women's representation, women's movement, and gender-based violence. And she has published widely in these areas. Her latest book, Feminist Institutionalism in South Africa, Designing for Equality, from 2022, has just appeared with Roman and Littlefield. She has also been a commissioner for the South African Commission for Gender Equality. And another one of the project partners is Dr. Manditsa Paritse from Great Zimbabwe University, and also working at the Namibia University of Science and Technology in Windhoek. She holds a PhD in communication studies, the area of gender and media. And she has experience in providing technical support and management of conflict prevention programs. She is a qualified and experienced peace builder and gender specialist. Her strengths also include strengthening organizational capacities in innovative programming, building and strengthening capacities in results-based programs and research. So welcome to all of you. The program will be in this way that Mona-Lena Krook will provide a keynote for us at around 35 minutes, which will be followed by the discussions, Amanda House and Manditsa Paritse. And then we will return to Mona-Lena for some short comments and open for a general debate from the Q&A section. So I will really encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A section, and then I will read them aloud. I will end with some few concluding comments. So please, Professor Mona-Lena Krook, the platform is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. So I have a PowerPoint. I'll just to share that. Get that up. Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you about my book, Violence Against Women in Politics, which was published in 2020 during the middle of the pandemic with Oxford University Press. And this was a project that was initially inspired by work that I had done on electoral gender quotas, which are policies that have now been adopted in more than 130 countries around the world, the most since 1995. And so my first book, Quotas for Women in Politics, looked at the diffusion of these policies around the world and tried to explain their varied impact on the numbers of women elected. The second big project that I worked on tried to expand this focus to look beyond numbers. So to think about what kinds of women are elected through quotas, what impact do they have on policymaking, and what effects quotas and the greater presence of women in politics had on policy, had on both women and democracy. And as I was doing fieldwork for this second project in 9 countries across Western Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, I expected among other things, to hear positive stories of transformation, especially in terms of greater acceptance of women as political leaders. And in the course of my interviews, I did hear some of these positive stories, but I also heard accounts of resistance and backlash, often taking the forms of violence, harassment, and intimidation. So around the same time that I was puzzling over this issue, a number of practitioners were also observing similar dynamics in their work on the ground to increase women's political participation, including organizations like UN Women, the Interparliamentary Union, and the Inter-American Commission of Women. And in 2015, I connected with colleagues in the Gender, Women, and Democracy team at the National Democratic Institute, and we decided to collaborate to try to bring global attention to this issue. And in 2016, we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics, with a speech from NDI Chair Madeleine Albright and testimonies from political women around the world. So it's really, I think, from the start, a focus on this as a global problem that wasn't just affecting individual countries. So on the basis of my discussions with practitioners, I decided to write a book that could be read by both policymakers and academics, organized around these four main questions. So first, where did the concept of violence against women in politics come from, right? How did political women around the world come to name their experiences in this way? Second, how is it different from other forms of violence in politics? People often say that politics is a violent space, so perhaps it's not surprising that, as more women are entering these spaces, they also face violence. Third, what does violence against women in politics look like? What forms does it take around the world? And finally, what can be done to address violence against women in politics? And across these chapters, I look at solutions and the social and political implications of not taking action. So in this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on these last three questions, but really try to give you an overview of the book as a whole. So before I start, I think it's probably a good idea to clarify what I mean by the concept of violence and the term women in politics. So for many people, violence refers to the use of physical force. Right, so some scholars talk about this as a minimalist definition of violence, which privileges the perspective of the perpetrator and focuses on an act that takes place at a discrete moment in time, right, with a clearly identifiable beginning and end. In contrast, more comprehensive definitions understand violence as a violation, and specifically as a violation of integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self. Right? So from this perspective, a person's physical integrity can be violated, but also their mental or emotional integrity as well. And this approach shifts the focus to the targets and their experiences of violence, pointing out that violent acts can have ripple effects that can affect the target as well as members of their families and their communities for years to come. So the second understanding is very much in line with how women's rights activists think about gender-based violence, right, which they argue exists along a spectrum or a continuum of violence, where different acts sort of represent or tap into the same phenomenon, but also, interact and bolster one another. Right. So the classic image is this one on the right of the iceberg, where those visible physical acts are just the tip, right? And there's a whole range of other acts underneath the surface, right, that we might not recognize at first. Things like gendered insults and sexual harassment, right? And they're this large mass under the surface, right? So they share something with those physical acts, but they also bolster it as well, right? Makes these even more dramatic events. In terms of women in politics, so my early work focused on female politicians, but my book really started to think about this more broadly. And I think that this is a phenomenon that is about women's political participation more broadly, right? Women's efforts to participate in politics in a wide range of political roles. And I think that this is an approach that helps to link parallel campaigns that have developed roughly during the same time period, focusing on violence against female politicians, violence against women human rights defenders, and violence against women journalists, right? Because these are all like different aspects of women's political rights. But if we have this definition, we could also think about it, about the violence that women face as voters, as party members, as election officials, and as staffers, interns, right, just basic volunteers in public life as well. Okay, so we just turn to the theoretical framework. One of the main contributions of the book, I think, is to try to distinguish between what I call violence in politics and violence against women in politics. So violence in politics is how political violence has traditionally been understood, right, as being directed at political opponents. So in that sense, it's issue-based, right? It's about implementing your policy vision over the other side's policy vision. And this is a form of violence that affects both men and women, and tends to be higher in context where there's a greater impunity for violence, right, where people aren't punished for being violent. So maybe post-conflict context, conflict situations in particular, but also places where state capacity to enforce the law is relatively low, right? So it's not as costly to perpetrate these acts. And these forms of violence can take some gender differentiated forms, right? So for example, using sexual violence against female supporters of another party, right? So it's against women, it's using a gender-based form of violence, but it's really for these like political reasons, right? These party political reasons. The democratic costs of this kind of violence are very well recognized by democracy practitioners in sort of the legal world as well. And this is because one side sort of gets its way through force and intimidation, right, rather than through, you know, fair and free democratic elections. Violence against women in politics, as I understand it, is not issue-based as much as it's identity-based. So it specifically targets women, driven by the patriarchal idea that politics is a male space, and women therefore need to be kept out. It can also take some gendered forms, right, like sexual violence, but it can also take typically non-gendered forms like assassinations, right, if it's motivated by the identity of the target. And I think that the democratic costs of this form of violence are not yet widely recognized. It is why I think these conversations are so very important. And I think there's a few reasons why these democratic costs have not yet been widely recognized. First, I think it's simply a fact that patterns of violence against women are just highly normalized in many societies. Right? So these are acts that don't really seem to be out of the ordinary, right? So they don't attract much attention, right? It's just the cost of being a woman in society, right? Second, I think there's often a tendency to equate acts of violence against women in politics with ordinary violence in political spaces, right? So these identity-based attacks are framed instead as being issue-based, right? As not involving the identity challenge. And finally, most politically active women experience both of these forms of violence, sometimes at different moments in time and sometimes at the same moment. And I think nonetheless that it's still very important to try to recognize these two dimensions, right? Even if it's hard to disentangle them in practice. So just to give you some support for this distinction, here's a figure from a study done by UN Women on violence against politically active women in India, Pakistan, and Nepal. So this was using a very broad definition of violence faced by women in public life. And you can see here, they were asked who were the main perpetrators. So if you look, the largest share mentioned by respondents in India were political rivals, right? But if you look across the three countries as a whole, you see that the most common perpetrators are members of women's own political parties and members of their own families. Right, so these findings are surprising if we only understand political violence as being issue-based, right? But they're not surprising if we draw on insights from work on gender-based violence, right? Which shows that women are more likely to experience violence at the hands of people they know, right? The members of their family and members of their organizations and their professional spaces, right? So in this data, we can see both the violence in politics and violence against women in politics. Talking about violence against women in politics, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that gender is the only salient identity. So in my interviews and in the emerging research in this area, we see, for example, that younger women and women of color, ethnic minority women, tend to face even higher levels of abuse, right? So there's a magnification of the violence that they face. But again, this is not surprising because the violence against women in politics framework suggests that women are attacked because they're not seen as rightful participants in political spaces, right? So this is an insight that should logically also hold for people who challenge the status quo in other ways as well, right? So people that don't typically look like the older ethnic majority male politician. So I think that's also really interesting to think about the diversity amongst women as well. So all of this is to say that not all forms of violence faced by politically active women are cases of violence against women in politics. So what really matters, in my view, is the motive, right, rather than the fact that it's a woman who's being targeted. Okay, so then looking at what this violence looks like in practice. So most practitioners focus on 4 types of violence, which are widely recognized in international conventions and domestic legislation, namely psychological, sexual, physical, and economic violence. So this is a table from the first global study of this topic by the Interparliamentary Union. And I think that it really shows why it's so important to think beyond just physical violence as our definition of violence. So around 25% of women in the study reported that they'd experienced some form of physical violence, but more than 80% said they'd experienced some form of psychological violence. And around 1/3 had experienced economic violence, and around 20% had experienced sexual violence. Right, so if we only look at physical forms, it doesn't really capture what women are experiencing on the ground, especially the widespread nature of psychological abuse. So in my book, I go on to try to give some examples of these 4 types of violence in practice. And I use cases from both the global north and the global south, because I really want to emphasize the fact that this is not just a problem affecting women in particular countries, particular parts of the world. It is really something that's experienced by women in many different diverse contexts. So just give you some examples, right? So physical violence, I think that's intuitive to understand. It would include things like murders, kidnappings, beatings, even false imprisonment. Example I have here is from a local politician in Bolivia who, after she was faced with psychological violence and economic violence, sexual violence, she was ultimately murdered when she just wouldn't leave politics. And her killers have never been held to account for her murder. And this was a case that spurred passage of the first law in the world to criminalize political harassment and violence against women in Bolivia, which happened in 2012. Okay, so psychological violence in this context typically involves things like death and rape threats, intimidation, stalking. Probably the most common form is online harassment, so abuse on social media, through email. And so we can see here, for example, one report of one study looking at the issue of online abuse of women members of parliament in the UK, which found that it affected women across all political parties, but it was especially directed at women who were Black and Asian, through ethnic minority women in UK politics, with the most abuse directed at Diane Abbott, who's the longest or the first, she's longest serving Black woman in Parliament, but also the first woman ever elected, Black woman elected to Parliament in 1987. All right, so the sexual violence, I think maybe that's also intuitive, but it could include things like rape, sexual harassment, sexualized threats. And it's really traditionally been, I think, the most difficult form of violence against women in politics to speak up about. But I think the Me Too movement has made that a little bit easier in recent years. And actually, if I show you, just go back to this figure. So one of the ways that people have often tried to get around the fact that violence is sort of a stigmatized experience is that you say, did you experience it, or do you know someone else who experienced it, right? And the idea is that the answer is probably, people might not want to say that they experienced it, but they'll say, well, my friend did, right? And so it's actually probably a little bit closer to what people say their friends experienced than what they say they experienced. So the IPU did this in their study, and you can see it's pretty similar response, for psychological, physical, and economic violence, just like a couple of percentage points. With sexual violence, you can see that about 22% of women said they personally experienced it, but almost 33% said they know other women who'd experienced it, right? So the answer is probably a little bit closer to the 33%, right? And it'd be interesting to see, now this was before Me Too, that this is actually probably maybe something women would be more likely to speak up about, but I think it's still very, very difficult. Okay, so economic violence, finally, would refer to using access to economic resources as a form of intimidation or coercion. So here it could involve, destroying women's campaign materials, vandalizing their homes and their offices, and trying to ruin their economic livelihoods, right? So making it difficult, if not impossible, to continue their political work. So the example here is from the 2018 elections in Iraq, where women's campaign posters were systematically destroyed. It was so bad, the UN focal point had to say, brought the parties together to say, look, you have to stop destroying women's campaign materials, right? It was very difficult for women to be able to campaign on an equal footing with men, right? And so I think that's really important part of this discussion. So in addition to these four types in my book, my work more generally, I also try to recognize a fifth type that I argue is not included in these existing typologies. And that's something I call semiotic violence. So this would include using words or images to degrade and delegitimize women as political leaders, primarily in front of a larger public. Okay, so this would be examples like photoshopped images depicting women in sexually graphic and humiliating ways, false sex tapes released during elections, and deepfake videos portraying women in false and misleading ways, right? So these are things that, you Photoshop something and then you put it on Twitter and it gets amplified, right? It's not necessarily, the woman who's in the picture doesn't necessarily even know that she's, they've Photoshopped her in this way, right? The idea is to really more broadly delegitimize and degrade women in political life. And semiotic violence, I think, is something that has characterized, portrayals of women in public life throughout history, but it has really gained new life, an urgent life, with rising gendered disinformation campaigns around the world. This is like the way that gender disinformation often works, is through these fake videos, through these fake images, right? Through these false stories about women in public life. Okay, so then, given this widespread problem, what can we do? So in my book, I try to give a wide range of examples of solutions that tackle individual types of violence, but also solutions that cut across those different types of violence. And I would say that what I have learned from this work is that really everyone can do something. And so here I'm just going to focus on a few examples looking at what actors at different levels can do to address violence against women in politics. So I think the first, maybe overarching strategy is awareness raising, which I think is really something everyone can do. So examples here would be like NDI is not the cost campaign. We selected this slogan because we just kept hearing that, well, you know, violence is just the cost of doing politics for women, right? If you want to do politics, you just have to deal with this type of violence. And we really tried to argue that we shouldn't just accept that, right? We should say it should not be the cost of women's political participation. You know, especially when it's something that keeps women out of public life. It makes it difficult for women to have a voice in public debates. So it should not be the cost. But other people who've worked on this, you know, worked individually or collectively. You have women politicians giving talks, writing books about their individual experiences. You have women coming together to write open letters about you know, talking about their experiences and saying this is just, it's not acceptable, and we need to break the silence about this problem. If we go to individual specific actors, if we see at the global and state levels, there have been some efforts around the world to develop international frameworks and national legislation. So the UN has been very active in this regard. So you can see here is a General Assembly resolution that talks about all acts of violence against women and girls involved in political and public life, including women in leadership, journalists, and women human rights defenders, right? So it becomes important to put this into the international normative framework. In Latin America, we've seen a big effort to try to introduce legislation on this issue. So I mentioned Bolivia has a law passed in 2012, but it inspired a number of other countries to propose bills with very, like, almost copying and pasting the Bolivian legislation, which was developed through discussions with locally elected women in Bolivia. And it was such a discussion that the Organization of American States created this Inter-American Model Law to sort of use the lessons learned to help countries write more effective legislation on this issue. There are a couple of countries outside of Latin America that have also included violence against women in politics in some way in their legislation, like Tunisia, for example, in their violence against women law. It includes political violence as a type of violence experienced by women, for example, but very much a Latin American phenomenon more generally. If we look at parliaments, there have been a number of initiatives to address the safety of politicians, right? How to make them more secure when they go out and try to campaign and try to work with their constituents, you know, just so they can do their basic work as elected officials. There's also been a number of efforts in parliaments to create new codes of conduct to sort of say like what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior, right? It's not just like everything's fair in politics and war, right? But this idea that there are limits to how we should behave towards our colleagues and our opponents as well. I'd not just give an example here of the United States, because people often ask me as an American, you know, what is anything happening in the US? So this has been an issue that's become more in focus over the last few years. And in 2020, 5 women, Democratic women, members of Congress, introduced a resolution calling attention to violence against women in politics as a global problem, including in the United States, and calling on the government to take action. So you can see that if you know their names, right, 4 of these are the most prominent women of color in the US Congress. And Jackie Spear, who's the 5th one, is she's been very involved with combating sexual harassment in US Congress as well, right? So there's just these initiatives at different levels to try to say that this is an issue and we should do something about it. Lastly, we've seen a number of civil society-led strategies, which have included, for example, collecting women's stories. This was very big during the Me Too movement, the early days. Like, can we just collect together women's experiences, right, and get a sense of the problem and think about ways that we can go about using those experiences to inform policy solutions. You also have efforts like the one on the right, which is using technologies to create a more positive environment for women online. So ParityBot, which was piloted in a number of countries, would detect abusive tweets directed at women during elections and would respond with these more positive messages. So it wasn't just like all the negative, right, the threats and the insults, but it also tried to create a more positive space for women and for you know, the candidates, but also women voters and women online more generally. So just close with 2 resources that I created as a companion to my book. So the left is a Twitter account, the right is a website with you know, the latest news and research on violence against women in politics. So on the right, the website, it includes both publications by academics as well as practitioners, and includes links to those sources, so that it's quite a quick way to get up to date with what the debates currently are. And I think it's interesting that I've almost had a hard time keeping up because there's such a momentum, more and more people working on this question, which is also very, very exciting, of course, as well. So I'll just end there and say thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring presentation, Mona-Lena. And now I will pass the platform on to, or pass the word on to Amanda Rouse as one of the project partners to provide some comments or questions to Mona-Lena. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to engage, and thank you for your very interesting seminar, Mona-Lena, and congratulations on your book. I think it makes a very important contribution. So I want to talk a little bit about our project that is in the African context. And I think what your book does very well is to set out the different types of violence and how we need to think about it in terms of differentiating that from violence in general. But if you take a context like the South African context, which is the one that I'm working in, it is an incredibly violent country. And its violence manifests itself through its very high rape statistics, which is around 45 to 50,000 cases, reported cases per year. But I mean, it's much higher if we think about unreported cases. And our femicide rate is 5 times the global average. So if you think about that, then, you know, violence against women is just really an everyday occurrence. And so I think what I want to talk a little bit about is that, so how does this then manifest in terms of women participating in politics? And here I want to bring in the electoral system. Because I think where you have a majoritarian system or first past the post system, one can identify candidates, right? You have candidates standing in single member or multi-member districts, and they can be identified. So one would think that maybe in cases like that, there's a higher risk for women. We have a proportional representation closed list system, which means that our candidates get onto a list, and they are elected in proportion to the numbers of the vote, which means that it's important where the names of people are on that list. And that means that the party leaders have a very big power in how they actually put together those lists. And that's, I think, where the violence starts. The violence starts right at branch level, because the way it works is that the branches nominate people that goes on to what we call a slate. And slate politics are very dangerous because if you're not on that slate, chances of you not making it into parliament is rather big. So right at branch level, men try to prevent women to get onto the slate. And that can be actually quite violent processes in putting together that list. Then it goes to the provincial level and up to national level that actually then finally decides on the final lists. But we've seen that the way that politics plays itself out on the branch level is not through negotiation. It's not through informed debate, but it is really through physical violence. And it makes it very difficult for women to participate. We've done a survey that showed that 74% of the women asked in that survey, would they be interested in participating as candidates in politics, said no, they won't, because it is very dangerous. So I think that so it's physical violence, but it is also in the African case hate speech. And I think, Mona-Lena, this is what you refer to as semiotic violence. So the things that get said about women, and it's very focused on the anatomical body, on women's genitalia, and all kinds of insults, that is really very degrading. And of course, candidates being involved in social media and on social media platforms are the ones that are really suffering from this type of hate speech. So I think if we then take sort of a violent context, we need to find, I think, indicators that would, if we want to do empirical work, distinguish between what is just part of a violent context and what is part of violence against women that really undermines their political participation. And I think we don't see this type of violence on, for example, the election days. We've always had free and fair elections, and we've had limited violence. But so it's what happens before we get to the elections. And what is an increasing problem in South Africa now is political assassinations, that people who run as candidates, whether they're men or women, are assassinated. So the question here is then, is it an issue-based or is it identity-based, right? Are they being killed because they're women? Because men are also being killed. And party politics here play a very important role. So it's not only inter-party, but it's also intra-party. So members of the same party kill each other. And I think that's where it becomes a bit murky. How do you determine whether this is just, any candidate, regardless of gender, could be a target? And then there's also, in the African case, ethnic violence, because, belonging to a certain identity group may make you a target regardless of your gender. So I think those are sort of issues that I think it's murky. And how do we tease this out then and to say, well, this is violence against women, or this is just general political violence because of a very violent context. Yeah, let me just see if there. Yeah, I would say those are sort of, I mean, we are in the beginning of this project, so we're starting to think about this. I think, yeah, for me, it's about the creation or the, you know, how you create those indicators to measure the empirical reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I hope it's okay with Mona Lena that we also take some inputs from Manditsa Pariti. Manditsa, please, the platform is yours. If you would like to also provide some inputs and questions for Mona Lena.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, Mona Lena, for the insightful and very relevant discussion and presentation. I am excited because I've read much of your work, and congratulations on your publication, which is also relevant. I'm more fascinated because you have gone beyond academia to work with relevant stakeholders on this subject. My issue, particularly in relation to the projects that we are working on, is violence against female politicians remains underexplored. And unfortunately, women subjected to it in Africa also rarely report for fear of intimidation or not being believed. And from what I have been reading, violence against women in politics policies are also supposed to be generated from the existing data. And as we have also noticed in Africa, perpetrators are rarely held accountable. Institutions in Zimbabwe that are expected to provide justice for women experiencing violence are inadequately capacitated. I just wanted to know from your point of view and from your experience and work, how other countries have managed this challenge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Manditsa. There seems to be quite a lot of focus on these matters about context and how context matters. I guess you could say that in our project, we have Ghana, Kenya, and Zimbabwe as the three country case studies, and they have been selected because they are different in terms of levels of women's political representation, trajectories of electoral violence, and also different in terms of levels of democratization. So it's of course an important question, and one we will also work on answering. How does context matter for the manifestations of violence against women in politics? I was also thinking, you have adopted this very broad notion of violence against women in politics with this continuum of violence. As mentioned by Amanda, we are yet to carry out the interviews in the local context. But I do have some examples from Ghana, which points towards, for example, women whose shops have been targeted, especially when we speak about women at the local level and also at national level, women who have been assaulted and so on, and quite a lot of insults, which are even labeled a politics of insults, ridicule, and rumor against female parliamentarians. So clearly some of these notions of violence against women in politics are very relevant. But I was wondering if you could provide some inputs on, I mean, what are the pros and cons of adopting this very broad notion of violence against women in politics, and how do we actually measure violence against women in politics with such broad conceptualizations? I'm also guessing that, I mean, it has some implications for the strategies to combat violence against women in politics. That makes it quite inclusive. I think I will leave you to to try to reply on this, and then I will also encourage the people online to actually post some more questions in the Q&A function. It's really, now is the opportunity. Please, Mona-Lena, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think this is a topic that we're still, trying to figure out this phenomenon and how best to study it. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to have these discussions, especially as you're setting out on this new research project. So, I mean, I have a lot of things to say. Maybe I'll just start with what Diana just said about types of violence. So this is one of the points of contention, right? So what do we count as violence and what don't we count? And a good example of a group that has mainly just focused on physical violence is ACLED. It's like a conflict database, and they have a new measure of political violence targeting women. And so they only look at physical forms of violence and then like sexual violence to the extent that they can find information about physical sexual attacks against women. And, I think that their work is incredibly valuable because they've managed to find, for example, that demonstrations that are largely feature women are much more likely to face a violent crackdown than demonstrations that are mixed or are mainly men, right? So there's something about women demonstrating that really seems to be provoking a violent response on the part of especially state authorities. So I find that incredibly valuable. But I also find it problematic because if we know that that's probably like the most common form of violence, we're sort of missing out on the bigger picture. But, ACLED is very specific about like, we are only looking at physical violence. We recognize it's limited, right? And so I think like that's maybe a compromise situation, right? To say that there are more forms of violence. There's also, I think, this very interesting thing you said about the local level. So people tend, to the extent that people have studied this question, has been really at like the national political level. But what we know anecdotally is that it's probably the case that women in local politics face a lot more violent. They're more vulnerable to violence because, women who are like in parliament or in cabinet, there are certain measures of security and protection, resources, right, for them to fit out their offices or bodyguards, things like this. Whereas women, in local politics are, especially if it's like a rural village, right? People know where your family, where you live, where your children go to school, right? And so it's much easier to target you, or there's not like security to stop people walking into the town hall, right? And so it becomes, I think, a much greater degree of exposure or vulnerability to violence and fewer protections, right? But we know much less about the local level because, precisely because it's the local level. But I do find it very interesting that, the Bolivian law that I mentioned, it came out of work of locally elected women, particularly indigenous women in rural areas, because a gender quota requires 50% female candidates. And so they really faced very high level of violence. People, knew where they lived, whatever. It became, a really big problem over the last 20 to 30 years or so. But women came together in a network and they started to talk about their experiences. And they start to like catalog like all the different things. So obviously there were physical attacks, but then they were like, you know, the threatening letters, the, you know, forced resignations, right? Like they came up with a very long list of examples that they felt fell underneath the concept of violence and harassment of women in politics. So it's interesting, like how they start to think about it was in this much broader way, right? That it wasn't just about the physical acts, but these other examples like of the continuum of violence, which makes that Bolivian legislation really interesting because it's such a long, like, can include, but is not, you know, limited to the following examples. So I think that they would say also that it is much broader than physical violence, but, you know, how to measure that is more difficult. And I think this gets to Mandy's question about disclosure, right? I think one of the difficult things in studying violence against women in general is the underreporting, right? Because it's either normalized or women are stigmatized if they speak up about these issues, right? So it becomes very difficult for them to name the problem and to speak out against this violence. And I've had the experience, and other colleagues have talked about this in their work as well, that you know, in the course of talking to women politicians, they're like, oh no, I don't experience any violence. And then you say, well, did you experience this? Did you experience that? And they're like, oh yes, that. And also that, and like, oh, I can give you another example of my, you know, female colleague who experienced this other thing, right? And at the end of the interview, they're like, oh, I actually have experienced violence against women in politics. So there's also this aspect of like, the research itself is like raising awareness or helping the disclosures a little bit, even if it's still very difficult to talk about. I actually there's a chapter in my book about data collection and documentation challenges, because, you know, when women don't want to talk about it, how do we get an accurate gauge of what they're experiencing, how common it is it on the rise? Like we just don't know that information with, you know, great accuracy just yet, but hopefully, you know, with more informed research and, you know, teams out there, I think you're more likely to get more of that information. Yeah, okay. And then I just on some of the points that Amanda made about violence against, you know, within political parties, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that there was a wonderful research project done by NDI on violence against women in political parties in like 4 countries. And it was fascinating because it really opened up, like, political parties, like, people don't want to talk about this even more because you're like bad mouthing your own party if you're talking about your colleagues who are, you know, committing acts of violence against you. There's that pressure to not disclose as well, but it really seems to be like a very common form of violence. And especially at the nomination stage. And this is, I think, also where it connects to gender quotas, because, you know, as you have, you know, requirements to have female candidates, there are some men who are going to lose their positions on list, right? Which they may have expected, feel entitled to. And so when they are pushed off the list, they get very angry, right? And they commit acts of violence against women in their parties. And in Bolivia, again, I mean, it's just a really well-studied case. One of my former students had done a whole project on this. And what she found was that one of the things, they have a system in Bolivia where there's the main candidate and then there's the alternative candidate. So like there's some reason the main candidate can't continue in the work, right? The alternate comes in. So what happened is you have this case where women are the main candidate and men are the alternates. So the male alternates would like threaten, create, you know, false, you know, fake resignation letters to get the women out of office, right? So they could take their positions. And so it became a huge issue. They also like would try to tell the women, you know, often, you know, maybe not very educated or rural women or indigenous women that, you know, maybe were illiterate, that, you know, they had to share their salary 50-50, or that halfway through the the term, they had to resign and then let their alternate come in. Like there was all sorts of manipulations to try to make sure that these quotas weren't working and that women were being replaced by men. And so it became a very big issue. So I think that it becomes really important to think about how women are vulnerable in these spaces, not just like opponents from other parties, but also within these spaces and people who are supposed to be on the same political side. I think there's more that I can say, but maybe I'll open it up to the other questions first.
Yes, thank you very much, Mona-Lena. I will just read out a comment that Manditsa has written. She says, in Zimbabwe, social media has been fairly more difficult to manage in terms of violence against female politicians because of the trolls and anonymity, which makes it even more difficult to bring perpetrators to book. May you share insights on how other countries, if any, have managed this challenge? And I could add that could also be interesting to hear why there has been this increase in semiotic violence. Is it mainly due to an increase in online violence, or yeah, I don't know if you want to answer this now, or I should take a few more questions.
I think, I mean, the question about online violence, I think, is a pretty big one. So, so I think, well, the first thing I'll say is that a question that I often get is this problem on the rise? Is it getting worse? And it's actually really hard to know, right? But I think there's a few things that might be, you know, like spurring violence, right? And one of them has to do with technological advances, right? Like just all these platforms that didn't used to exist. And I have, you know, spoken to politicians in diverse countries, people who've been in politics for a long time. And, you know, some of them will say, oh, it's just the same amount of violence as before, it's just on more platforms, right? And then there's others who say, no, actually, like it was bad, but now it's like magnified worse because of social media. And I think social media is one of those things that, you know, people before, like if they have to write a letter, they have to like write the letter, they have to put it into the envelope, they have to put the stamp, they have to find your address, they have to send, you know, there's many steps that it takes to do that, which deters people from doing it. But sending an email or posting something on social media is very quick and easy to do, right? So it does make it easier. So that's on the one side. On the other side is that, you know, people can, you know, come into your homes and your private space because it's, you know, they're doing these attacks and it's on your phone, right? Or in your computer. And then you're not just, you know, at the workplace, right? Or out in a public, you know, the public assembly space, right? But it's also comes, you know, maybe late at night when you're getting ready to go to bed or something like that. And you see this, right? And so it's very easy to reach politicians and other, politically active people, right, through this way. And so I think that's been really important. I think something that has twinned with that is rising levels of like political polarization in many parts of the world. So like in the US, we've seen this huge, like, it's impossible for the Democrats and Republicans to speak to each other, right? There's like this real like dehumanization of the other side. And I think like that combined with this technological change, right, has made it a really toxic mix for anybody in public life, but I think especially, you know, women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ plus community, that has made it more difficult for diverse people to participate in politics. But another couple of explanations would relate to, you know, introduction of quotas, right? Is that spurring a backlash in places with and without quotas? The fact that there are more women being elected than ever before, many more diverse groups of women also coming into public office, right? Is that spurring you know, a sense of like people who want to defend the status quo, right? So they are really attacking people who are representing diversity and change. So I think like the social media component is an important part of that, but there are these like other developments I think are making, bringing this issue on the agenda. But yeah, in terms of social media, I would say this is probably like the fastest growing area of research on violence against women in politics, because it's such an issue in so many countries. So I can find like when I'm putting things on the Violence Against Women in Politics website, there's like often about social media, and they tend to be about describing the problem, giving the numbers, talking about what it looks like. There's a little bit less on solutions. And I think this is where it becomes difficult because, you know, like, for example, perpetrators maybe in one country, right? But the targets are in another, you know, so like how do you keep people accountable? Like if there was a national law, that fact that people can be anonymous, right? Could put a different name or a fake name. We don't know where they're based, right? So it's hard to keep people accountable. And there was for a while, like some interest by social media companies to actually take to work on this problem of abuse and violence, intimidation, harassment. But it seems like, especially with Elon Musk's, you know, purchase of Twitter, that's like, it's just gone the other direction, where he's letting white supremacists and misogynists back on these platforms. So it's hard to know, right? Like without their help, I think it'd be very difficult. But there is one example that I can think of where there has been some accountability, and that has been in the UK, where several politicians have been able to take, you know, these harassers to court because it was so, not only at such a level, but also because there are laws about, you know, intimidation, that, you know, the idea that like, if somebody intimidated you like on an offline way, they'd be held accountable. So we should also think about that when they do that in an online space. So there are some people who have been convicted of these as crimes against women in Parliament, for example. But I think this is like such an issue. Like, how do we work on trying to make online spaces safer for women? I think we still have conversations to have on that question.
Yes, definitely. I agree with you. Personally, I have actually seen someone's phone who is actually at a quite high level in one of the political parties in Ghana, and read some of the threats of rape and also death that she received. So that is really terrible cases in that sense. But there is actually another question in the Q&A function about semiotic violence. It says, how do we address semiotic violence in context where speech is highly protected institutionally? For example, the United States of America.
Yeah, no, I definitely, sorry, I've got this sign here. So yeah, I think this has been a big part of the debate, right? This idea that like people should be able to insult or threaten people online because it's free speech. And there's, you know, quite a lot of people who work on like online abuse, like generally not just in against political targets. And I think one of the really interesting responses that's been developed is like, well, these are people who are using their speech to prevent the free speech of others, right? Because the goal of like trolls who attack, you know, women is to get women to leave the space, to stop speaking up about important issues. And so like, if we're talking about whose free speech should be protected, right? I think we should argue that it would be the marginalized group, right? Because that's about free speech in general versus the right of dominant groups, right? To shut down people who challenge their levels of power. I've also, in my work in the book and in other pieces, have really been thinking about this in relation to hate speech, right? Because we recognize there's some forms of speech that don't contribute to public debate, only like harm, right? Harm people. And I think that that's really, I think, a helpful way to think about, and Amanda mentioned that too, thinking about this as hate speech, I think is really useful for thinking about what it is and why it matters, and why it's undemocratic and challenges inequality. But I think this is also that difficulty of like, when it's something that's a word or an image, people say, well, but that's just a joke, right? That's not like real violence, right? But I think there's quite persuasive evidence that it does have these bigger effects, right? And I think one of the most powerful things I've read about the definition of violence is something written in the 1960s, and the author is trying to say we should think more about just physical violence, is because he says, with violent acts, you're not just attacking a body, you're attacking a person. And I think this is where that violation idea really comes out, that it's, it's not just physical acts that get at who you are as a person. So I think that's also, I think, really, really important.
Yes, thank you very much. There's one more question. I am a little bit unsure whether this question relates directly to what Amanda was talking about, or if it links to your speech, but I will try and read it loud and hope that one of you, or perhaps both of you, will address it. Did you find any examples of how the political parties in these countries are helping to stop this violence? Did you find examples of how these parties are inadvertently fueling this violence? And I will also encourage others to post some questions in the Q&A function.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any comments for this, Mona-Lena, and perhaps also Amanda afterwards.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, right? Because if so much of violence is happening inside of political parties, right? I think it's a very logical place to look at. So on the one hand, I think they're not doing much, right? Because acknowledging that violence happens inside the party is sort of an indictment of the party itself, right? That it permits the abuse of their members, right? And so this is why it becomes so hard to know like what's happening, right? Or how people are held accountable. And a lot of pressure for women not to disclose this these issues. And this also became a big discussion during the early days of the Me Too movement too, because a lot of sexual harassment happens inside of political parties. And when parties said, oh, well, we have measures, we have, mechanisms to deal with this. Well, they still would like keep, the harassing man in, and then it was usually the young woman, right, who would be leaving the party, right? So they tended to kind of protect the harassers rather than rooting out the problem of harassment. And so I think that parties have not necessarily done a good job on this. But there are some examples of parties that have said, they've taken like the codes of conduct route, right? So there are rules about, during meetings, right? You're not allowed to bully other people, right? Or that when you're on the campaign trail, you should, not use these tactics against your opponents, because it makes the party look bad, right? To use this type of, negative language or character assassination of your opponent, right? Rather than just like sticking to political ideas and political debates. And I think also, there's like efforts within like the party training, like helping people, say that this is just not acceptable as our sort of, it's not consistent with our party values to engage in this kind of harassment inside or outside the party. So those are just some examples, but I think it's a space where there's a lot more that needs to be to be done.
Okay,
Yes, well,
thank you very much. Will you also give some comments, Amanda, please?
yes, I think the problem also is that you need a political will to deal with this. So, you know, I don't think the parties in South Africa have a political will to deal with the problem, because, you know, a lot of the stakes are very high to get into government because of the patronage networks through which resources are really distributed. And so the police are complicit. So the police are not going to do a whole lot in stopping the violence, specifically intra-party violence, because they benefit from it as well. So, you know, I think this is the problem of countries where corruption has really become part of the norms of society, and you know, where they also intersect with traditional norms that sort of, and I'm looking at this currently in another project that I'm doing, where disciplining women is part of, you know, it is justified as part of culture. So the cultural defense is then used to keep women in their place, and then this just becomes an extension on a wider level where it's not in the privacy of the home anymore, but women become disciplined in public spaces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda and Mona-Lena. I can see we have one more question in the Q&A. I will read it out loud. It says, women in politics are mostly reluctant in speaking about the violence faced by them. How can we convince them to speak about it, mostly while conducting the qualitative research? And then I think we could also perhaps add, I mean, what are the kind of ethical considerations in relation to this kind of research? I don't know if you have any inputs on this, Mona-Lena.
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot. So I think there are a number of reasons, I think, why women haven't spoken up about this issue. And I think that I talk about this in like the first chapter of my book, but it's just like, just sort of summarize it as, I think there's some women who don't speak out. I call this like a cognitive gap, right? So they just don't see it as an issue, right? They normalize it. They don't think about it as a problem, right? So, and it's either normalized because they're in public life, or it's because they are women. And it's interesting that, you know, conservative women seem much less likely than more progressive women to speak up about this issue, although the data seems to suggest that they're facing this violence as, you know, as well, right? But they're less likely to speak up about it. And I think that is for some ideological reasons, right? Because they don't want to think about themselves as victims. They are more likely to embrace more traditional gender norms, right? So like women don't participate in politics maybe, whereas progressive women might be more like feminist in their orientation or understand that this is violence, right? So more likely to speak up. But I think the cognitive gap has been really important. I think there's also a political reason why, you know, a lot of women politicians, for example, will say, you know, I don't speak up about this because it gets weaponized against me, right? Because people say women already don't belong in politics. So if I speak up about it, they're like, oh, that shows that women are too weak. It's why women shouldn't be in public life. They can't handle this abuse. I mean, never mind that the abuse that women are facing is higher and of a much more sort of vitriolic nature than men, right? Men are criticized for their political ideas. Maybe they're insulted for being stupid, right? Whereas women are being, you know, attacked because they are, you know, said to be prostitutes, right? Or something that's much deeper, right? Type of threat, or, you know, threatened with sexual violence, rape threats, death threats, you know, kidnapping threats against their family. And so it's, you know, so women are sort of facing this idea that they can't speak out because it would hurt them politically, right? Undermine women entering politics. And then I think there are other women who sort of see the problem, but they just say, well, who would I tell, right? Like, who would believe me? Who would care? And I think that's sort of like a receptivity problem, right? There's no, women speak out and people say, you're lying, right? This isn't a problem. This didn't happen to you, or it's not a big deal, right? And so I think that is also, a huge part of the barriers to speaking up about this issue. On the flip side, I think that much like women's experiences in general, right? Like there hasn't been a language or concept to talk about a lot of women's experiences because, of course, we live in a patriarchal world, right? So a lot of the feminist movement, women's movement, has been about giving a name to women's experiences. Something like sexual harassment, right, didn't exist as a concept before women mobilized to name it as an issue, right? Before it was like, oh, it's just this type of flattery or flirtation, right? It wasn't seen as an abuse of power. And so you had to name it. And I think this is what's happened with violence against women in politics, right? It was something that was just like women have experienced for, hundreds of, thousands of years, right? But we have a word for it now, right? And it's interesting to me as I've talked to more, women in public life, and they sort of hear this concept and they get like, oh yeah, I've experienced that. And I didn't have a word for that, or I didn't think about it as something unusual, like that it was like systemic about keeping women out of public life. And then they become very, engaged in trying to combat this problem. And so I think that it's really about, understanding why they don't speak out, but right, kind of giving them the tools to think about their experiences and to understand it, I think is absolutely invaluable. And that's why I think awareness raising is such an important part of like the toolkit of solutions for combating this problem.
Okay, thank you very much. We actually just got a question more about the solutions, so I guess you can tie it together with where you ended, but this is a bit more specific. And the question is, what can be done to draw more attention to violence against women in politics, especially in fragile and security-sensitive settings, such as Somalia, where the extremist group Al-Shabaab has an active presence. So I know this may be a hard question for you. I don't know if you have studied Somalia, but maybe you can give some general comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there are a lot of I would say commonalities across countries, despite all the differences in context. I think that maybe it goes to what Amanda said about political will, right? There's like a role, for example, for the international community, right, to understand this problem and to speak up about it. And so I think like the special representative in Iraq was really interesting, Jan Kubush, because he like recognized this as violence against women in politics, right? He convened a meeting of the political, the political parties, right? And said, this isn't acceptable, right? And I think there's something about like, maybe to the role, to the degree that these actors play a role, I think it's really important for them to have the language or the knowledge to know that this is a particular form of violence. I also think that like, when international organizations are like doing candidate trainings, right? There's a lot of these for getting women to run campaigns in different countries around the world, like including, safety training, right? Thinking about online safety, offline safety. That's I think a really important part of like how women can engage, right, in politics, hopefully on more equal terms than men. I think it was the third one. Now I finished writing it before I started speaking, but I think that I think the most important thing is for really trying to give people a language to talk about it and to really emphasize the importance of action, right? It's not just like, oh, this is an unfortunate component or something that's just, what can we do about it? But actually to say again, like, it's not the cost. It's really important for us to talk about this issue and to recognize that it's a real challenge, right? Not just for gender equality, but also for democracy, for human rights, and you know, just letting it go, right? It prevents women from having a full and equal role in political life.
Okay, thank you very much, Mona-Lena. I do not see any more questions in the Q&A. So I think this will be the end of the webinar, and I would like to thank you, Mona-Lena Krook, for taking the time to be part of this. It was really interesting to hear more about your book and your experiences from traveling around in different parts of the world to obtain data about this global phenomenon. I would also like to thank the project partners, my project partners, Amanda House and Medica Perice, for taking part in this webinar, and my colleagues, or the head of the research unit, Elena Fischer, for the opening remarks, the kind opening remarks, and for the colleagues at the communications team for supporting me in doing this, supporting us in setting up this webinar. Even though it's the end, it is also the beginning of a series of webinars that we are going to conduct in relation to this project. We are planning webinars in relation to each country context once we have collected the data, and also some more general webinars about this phenomenon. So also thank you everyone for signing up. I think there's been a lot of food for thought from this afternoon's webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a fantastic afternoon.